I'm not sure if you're old enough to remember, like me, but we used to leave our front door wide open. We used to put cash in our letterbox to pay for the milk. Our parents never worried about us walking to the nearby dairy without parental supervision, and barely anybody had a burglar alarm system in their house. Today, our crime prevention strategy relies on restricting our freedom of movement by advising us to lock your doors and windows, keep valuables out of sight, install an alarm system, get sensor lights fitted, even don't post that you're going on holiday on your social media. The increase in heavy locks and chains, metal roller blinds for shop windows, private security patrols has shown just how unsafe our community has become. Thousands of crimes now occur in broad daylight because offenders are unafraid of being caught, or if caught, that the consequences will be minimal. It seems like the offenders have no fear, but that the general public are fearful of being caught in the middle of an armed robbery. How do dairy owners and jewellery store workers feel at the moment? The latest New Zealand National Survey of Victims in Crime shows that almost 1 in 3 New Zealand adults, 31%, experienced crime over the last 12 months. The incident rate for violent offences, which includes sexual assault, other assault, robbery, harassment and threatening behaviour, increased by 56% in 2022. Even frontline services are expressing concern.
The violence has become obvious to us with the amount of calls through the police and other and direct 111 calls to people being stabbed or shot.
What police have noticed since the end of lockdowns in September, October last year is there's definitely been an increase in crime in the central Auckland area. The amount of violence is the same, it's the seriousness of the violence that's increased.
Notice that they say that the nature of it, the level of the violence involved, is increasing. Gang-related shootings and the use of firearms in general, including against our police, have become disturbingly normal. In 2021, gun-related injuries recorded by the police hit a new peak. Firearm-related offences are nearly double that of just 10 years ago. Family violence call-outs to the police have almost doubled in the past decade, from 102,000 in 2013 to 191,000 in 2023. The Coalition Government of National, ACT and New Zealand First have announced that they're going to reinstate what we call the 3 Strikes Law, the law that gives clear consequences for repeat violent offenders. The key reason for introducing 3 Strikes Law and receiving widespread community support was because of the community outrage at serious violent or sexual offenders repeatedly getting parole and going on to commit more serious crimes. Remember William Bell and that horrific RSA case? There was also concern about light sentences which were out of kilter with the community's views. Just examine any child abuse case before court and see the community outrage. When we submitted on this law when it was first introduced in 2009, we showed the research that for a crime of indecencies with a child or young person, a crime which carries a maximum penalty of 14 years and 10 years respectively, the median custodial sentence was just 18 months and 13 months respectively. So how does the 3 strikes regime work? Well, there are 40 qualifying strike offences. It will cover the same 40 serious violent and sexual offences as the former 3 strikes legislation, with the addition of a new strangulation and suffocation offence. So we're talking about crimes such as sexual violation, sexual connection with a child or young person, indecent act on a child, murder, attempted murder, manslaughter, wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, aggravated robbery, kidnapping. That's just some of them. The 3 Strikes Law will only apply to sentences above 24 months, 2 years. If an offender is convicted of a strike offence with no previous strike warnings, they receive an official first strike warning. If the offender is convicted of a second qualifying offence, they are given a final warning, a second strike. And if they are sentenced to any time in prison as deemed appropriate by the judge, they may serve that full sentence given without parole. But if the offender is then convicted of a third qualifying offence, the court must impose the maximum applicable penalty without parole, unless the court considers it would be manifestly unjust to do so. Now, if the offender is convicted of murder on their second or third strike, the court may impose a life sentence without parole, unless once again the court considers it manifestly unjust. The government says it will extend the use of the manifestly unjust exception to allow some judicial discretion to avoid very harsh outcomes and address outlier cases, and it will provide a limited benefit for guilty pleas to avoid re-traumatisation of victims and to improve court delays. Three strikes operates on two angles. To those it can deter, it deters. To those it can't deter, it incapacitates for longer periods to protect the public. Pretty simple. And criminals aren't stupid. They are well aware of the law and its consequences. When the regime was scrapped by the previous Labour government, they effectively sent a message that we're not serious about the "it's not okay" zero tolerance message on family violence, or zero tolerance on gun violence or sexual assault. Is that why the interpersonal violence rate increased 56% in the same year that Labour scrapped the law? Well, it's a very good question. Now, addressing the underlying causes is relevant. That's definitely a discussion in itself, as is the rehabilitation services which should be available to prisoners wanting to change their ways. But it doesn't solve the immediate problem, protecting the public from violent offenders who keep offending. So how many people has the law impacted? The John Key-led government introduced the Sentencing and Parole Reform Act back in 2010, which set out New Zealand's first attempt at three strikes legislation. Since mid-2010, when it commenced, there have been 13,349 first strikes. There have been 640 second strikes. So 4.8% of first strikers have progressed to be a second strike. And then there have been 21 third strikes. So 3.2% of second strikers have gone on to do a third strike. If you look at how many first strikers graduated to a third strike, it's 0.16%. That's very low. That's a good thing. It's also pleasing that more than 95% of first strikers have not gone on to do a second strike. Now, let's look at those who have had a second or third strike. An Official Information Act request at the end of 2018 said that they had an average of 42 convictions as an adult. For third strikers, it's an average of 74 convictions. 91% were at a high risk of re-offending. 56% committed their second strike on bail or parole or while serving a sentence. And 40% have a strike-type conviction from prior to the three strikes regime. This data indicates that the three strikes regime is accurately targeting the serious recidivist offenders. The best and most obvious way to protect our communities from repeat violent offenders and from gun violence is to incapacitate the offenders. You can't commit crimes against families and communities if you're in prison. They are effectively being given two chances to stop their violent behaviour, and some would argue that that's too many. This law will send a clear message to repeat violent offenders and will protect families and communities from worsening levels of family harm, violent crimes and gun violence. Now, one of the arguments you'll hear for scrapping the law is that it disproportionately impacts Māori. But what you won't hear is this. Māori adults are significantly more likely to be victims of crime, than the average adult. The latest data says respondents who identify as Māori were significantly more likely to experience an offence by a family member, 5.2%, than the New Zealand average, 1.8%. Check this data from just last year. Look at the violent crime victims for Māori. It's tragic. Another argument is that we're wasting money on prisons. But instead of viewing prison-related expenses as a taxpayer burden, these expenses are an investment in the well-being, welfare and safety of families, and if done correctly, rehabilitation of the offender. They save costs such as lost productivity, medical care, security services, property damage loss, victim support, and intangibles such as reduced quality of life, pain, suffering, and mental anguish. When announcing their decision to scrap the law, the previous Labour government said that, quote, there is little evidence that the law has reduced serious offending, but they hadn't asked victims or victim groups. The Regulatory Impact Assessment report for this proposed scrapping of the law a couple of years ago admits that no victims had been consulted at all. The only official report is this one from 2018, which is 8 years after the first three strikes law was passed. And ironically, in that 2018 report, Ministry of Justice officials admit, in comparison with second strikeable offences committed before the law came into effect, there has been a drop in the number of second strike offences since the law's implementation. In fact, official documents show that there was a 34% reduction in criminals moving from a strike one offence to a strike two offence when comparing before and after the law was passed. 34%. That's 34% less victimisation. But here's some interesting data. Remember those frontline people in the video who said that there's not necessarily more offenders, but that the nature of the crime is much more violent? This police data may confirm that. We have had a steady decline in the number of offenders up until, you guessed it, 2022, when Labour removed the three strikes law. And then it started to increase. A coincidence? Perhaps the law is having the desired deterrent effect. A repeated slap on the wrist undermines our efforts to communicate the intolerance for violence. One of the other objections to the law is that it punishes offenders on their third strike with the full force of the law, and they tend to quote the bottom pincher, who under the law should receive the full punishment of 7 years for indecent assault. Now, it's actually worth reading the full facts of that case. Read the victim impact statement. But as we said before, the law allows for the prescribed sentence to be different if the court considers the sentence manifestly unjust. But I'm not too sure that the Me Too movement thinks we should be minimising these actions, and rightly so. And despite being eligible for parole 2 years ago, the parole board did not release the bottom pincher and wanted more treatment to reduce the risk of violent and sexual offending. Ironically, when Labour chucked out the law in 2022, the then Minister of Justice, Chris Farfoy, also said, "The public don't like this law."
The public don't like this law, and they gave us that message clear in 2020.
We released some polling just last year that shows that only 16% oppose the three strikes law. The green section represents support. 2 out of 3 Kiwis, 65%. And you'll notice that Labour supporters and even Green supporters, 41% of them, support it. Now in our next video, we'll introduce you to some strikers. It will give you a picture of the type of offenders being caught by the law. You'll quickly realise how important this law is. We believe that the three strikes law is correctly targeting repeat violent offenders. The best and most obvious way to protect the community from repeat violent offenders and from gun violence is to incapacitate the offenders. You can't commit crimes against families and communities if you're in prison. They are effectively being given 2 chances to stop their violent behaviour. For many, it's not strike 3, it's sometimes strike 17 or strike 29. Reintroducing the three strikes law will protect families and communities from worsening levels of family harm, violent crimes and gun violence. Go to threestrikeslaw.nz for more information. We'll also provide more detail on how you can make a submission on the Three Strikes Law version 2 when the government releases the full legislation to Parliament. Go to threestrikeslaw.nz.